Hello folks, I hope y'all are well and ready for this hurricane that we've got coming. Today we're going to be talking a little bit more about Macbeth, specifically about the issue of Hecate and the legacy of Macbeth's witches. So unfortunately we will not be able to get to Lady Macbeth today, which is unfortunate because I have been caught blue-handed. So, there have been a lot of conversations, sort of scholarly for a while, about whether Shakespeare actually wrote the character of Hecate, and the scenes in which she appears, right? So there's a chance that it's like an interpolation where somebody else has kind of added bits in, and that's kind of pretty well established as a debate. Particularly in Act 3, Scene 5, where Hecate claims to be the source of the witch's power. Which is a pretty pivotal scene if you're thinking about the witches in Macbeth, right? So, as we already know from reading and discussing medieval texts earlier this semester, stories don't exist in the vacuum. And often, especially with translations and transcriptions and, versions that go to print or whatever, the story is altered in significant or insignificant ways, and that doesn't devalue it. And this happens in modern stories too, right? Think about how many people's influence went into your idea of the character of Hermione in Harry Potter. J.K. Rowling, sure, because she wrote it, but also, the various directors of the films, the costumers, the designers, Emma Watson herself, and, countless sort of fan creators as well, kind of go into that conception of Hermione. So, the fact that there's debate about whether Shakespeare wrote Hecate as a character in Macbeth doesn't really diminish the text or what we can learn from it. It's just interesting. And also just because alternations were made to the text of this or other Shakespeare plays after the fact, this doesn't give credence to any of those, sort of really classist ideas that, Shakespeare couldn't have written all of these great plays because he was just, a poor, merchant's son or glove maker's son. So, clearly they must have been, ghost written by, King James or whatever malarkey's going around. They're Shakespeare's plays. It's accepted, and, they just are in the same way that, J.K. Rowling is always going to be tied to Harry Potter. Even though she's a TERF, and the fan community has done its best to distance itself from her. Because, Harry Potter fan community is a good and welcoming place. So, all that to say, it's worth noting, I think it's interesting that Hecate, who claims to be the source of the witch's power in Act 3, Scene 5, was, debatably written by Shakespeare, right? So, as far as additions go, consider why one might want to have some otherworldly force actually being in charge of controlling and directing the power of three seemingly lower or working class women who are able to drastically change the political landscape and the literal landscape of Scotland with a few words and some well-timed special effects, right? In late medieval and early modern British literature, very often Greek and Roman goddesses appear as sort of metaphorical, fae-type creatures, decidedly not of this world, and therefore kind of a safer way to discuss big ideas about power, gender, sovereignty, etc., because they don't belong to the same world as us. We've talked about this before in this class. So, in another Shakespeare play, The Tempest, Prospero, and or his servant Ariel, summons visions of Juno, Iris, and Ceres to bless Prospero's daughter's marriage. And these are goddesses Juno is the queen of the gods, Zeus's wife, and she's the goddess of marriage. Iris is the messenger god, and she also pours nectar at feasts of the gods, so she kind of embodies hospitality. And Ceres is a figure that represents agriculture, so they're blessing this marriage with these sort of otherworldly creatures that have this really significant symbolic meaning. This is Act 4, Scene 1 of The Tempest, if you're interested. I don't think that the goddesses are in the adaptation with Helen Mirren that I shared for this week. That's a supplemental text, but I thought it was an interesting comparison. I also think it's interesting to note that Hecate seems to summon and be summoned and like interact with sprites or fairy creatures as well, right? So she is solidly of that like otherworldly, fae-y kind of world, I think. So just consider as you're thinking about Macbeth, what is the purpose of the witches' prophecies in Act 1? Like, what, why do that? What about in Act 4? And, like, if Macbeth is doomed in Act 4, which kind of the prophecy sort of seem to suggest that, why show their power again? Like, who's changing the political landscape of Scotland here and why? There's not necessarily a right answer. I don't necessarily have a specific answer here, but I think, like, in the context of our semester-long discussions about, like, different ways that power works when we're talking about witches, I think that it's, like, interesting to think about. Also, you may have noticed, as you were reading, that the witches seem very familiar. This is because basically every English and American portrayal of witches after Shakespeare is, like, directly or indirectly influenced by Macbeth, which is part of what makes it such a rich text for this class. Many of the, like, ingredients they use in their spells and the phenomena that they describe appear elsewhere. Shakespeare didn't make it all up, of course. Nothing exists in a vacuum, but he sort of distilled a lot of these, like, illusions and folklore ideas into this stereotype and popularized it, for sure. So you'll see this influence kind of as we go on with the rest of the texts. In I Tituba, the residents of Salem seem afraid of, like, Macbeth-style witches. And the witches in Hocus Pocus, which we're watching for Halloween, also have big Macbeth vibes, to, like, name a couple. Okay, so just going to end a short one today. Just going to end with a couple of announcements and reminders. So paper 1 was due Monday, October 5th. So if you haven't turned it in yet, or emailed me to, like, talk about why you haven't turned it in yet, set up an alternate due date, you should do those things. Paper 2 isn't due until right before Thanksgiving, 11/23, so you've got some time, but I'm going to work on trying to get a prompt and video out for y'all soonish, just so you know. Also considering maybe having some peer review for this paper, so we're just going to have to sort of play that by ear and see where we're going with that. I also wanted to let y'all know we're starting I Tituba next. Got y'all starting that kind of over the weekend, and I'm going to talk about it in more detail next week in my video, but I want y'all to, I want to emphasize going in, I Tituba is a fictional story. It's a fictional account of a real historical figure that we know very little about, and who's not usually, heavily featured in conversations about the Salem witch trials. We don't know if the real historical Tituba was a black woman, but Condé's portrayal of her as one, is still really interesting and compelling, and it tells an important story, I think. You don't read a lot of, stories about black women in colonial America. You just don't. So I think that it's still really valuable, but it is fiction. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the Salem witch trials next week, but I hope y'all enjoy this story as much as I did. I really enjoyed I Tituba. Found it very compelling. I tore through it. There is a trigger warning, and this is on the Moodle as well, so you don't have to remember this right away, but there's a trigger warning for Part 2, Chapter 1. So feel free to skip that if you need to. It's page 91 to 94 in my book. In this, and in all things, please take care of yourselves. Again, be safe this weekend. Yeah. All right, have a good one. Bye, y'all.